Good afternoon and welcome to Adaptive Risk Management, Balancing Organizational Growth and Innovation with Security, a Health Systems CIO Media Inc. production sponsored by CrowdStrike. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. My name is Anthony Guerra. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Health Systems CIO, and I will be your moderator today. We're looking forward to your participation. You can send in your questions or comments in the Q&A box, and we'll take them later in the program. Nice way to view the screen. Click on the top center, get it in side-by-side mode. Then you can adjust the divider to get the video boxes and the slides the size you want them. And it should say speaker view in the top right-hand corner. Just so you see how we're going to spend our time today, we're going to go about 35-40 minutes with our main panel discussion featuring Ron Mehring, Chief Information Security Officer with Texas Health Resources, Sanjeev, VP and CISO with Centura Health, and Drex DeFord, Executive Healthcare Strategist with CrowdStrike. So lots of stuff to talk about. Let's jump right in. Ron, let's start with you. Can you give us an overview of your organization and your role?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Anthony. Once again, my name is Ron Mehring. I serve as the Chief Information Security Officer for Texas Health Resources. I have a bit of a blended role at Texas Health Resources, where I serve and lead the technology operations as well as healthcare technology management for the company. Texas Health Resources is located in North Texas, predominantly in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. We're a faith-based nonprofit integrated healthcare delivery system with around 29 hospitals and a slew of other underlying clinics and extended services we provide to our communities. And that's who we are. Thanks, Anthony.
All right, very good, Ron. Thank you. Sanjeev?
Hi, Anthony, thank you. My name is Sanjeev. I serve as Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer for Centura Health. We are caregivers on a mission to healing individuals and uplifting communities while advancing whole person care across Colorado and Kansas. Our ecosystem includes thousands of experts, 17 hospitals, clinics, and providers. As a security officer, as a technologist, I work to enable business capabilities, partnering with my stakeholders and partners with innovation in mind.
Excellent, thank you. Drex?
Hi, I'm Drex DeFord. I'm a longtime recovering CIO, having served in the U.S. Air Force as a CIO, Scripps Health, Seattle Children's, and Steward Healthcare. I'm now the executive healthcare strategist at CrowdStrike, one of healthcare's leading cybersecurity companies. We help secure critical areas of enterprise risk as a driver of our mission to stop breaches.
All right, very good, Drex. Thank you. All right, Sanjeev, let's start with you on this. Do you agree with the idea of CISO as Chief Risk Officer? Do you agree with the idea that CISOs aren't risk owners, but risk conveyors? And if so, how do these ideas help you to be effective?
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question. And I would also be interested in perspectives of my panelists here. But let me start by saying, in my view, we are risk officers with the goals of serving and supporting our mission, but at the same time, enabling safeguards and controls to protect the organization and hand-in-hand managing cyber risk. So we are most effective when we play both roles with the expertise and teams and capabilities that we have at our disposal. In one scenario where enabling safeguards and controls, it's really important to not lose sight of our roles as people who help enable those capabilities to protect the organization. At the same time, why are we doing that? And that perspective does come from us in our roles serving as risk officer, finding and having a place at the executive table in a way that we can then promote why we do what we do, and then gain their support and understanding of the right actions to take to, again, manage risk for the organization. Remembering that patient care, business operation, and patient safety is at risk when cyber risks are exposed.
Very good, Ron. You know, from what Sanjeev's saying, it really is a delicate balancing act. Is that how you would describe it? That's how what I heard, that there's a lot of nuances and you have to be deft in this role. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when you get into the role, number one, I don't believe a chief information security officer is a chief risk officer. That's a broader role within an organization. It has to deal with a multitude of company level risks that go beyond what a chief information security would manage. But I wholeheartedly agree what Sanjeev was saying regarding these different nuances and how we apply protection strategies. What is key though, and I think what is emerging out of the chief information security officer role, and I definitely think Sanjeev got to that point, is how important it is that this type of role as a chief information security officer really integrates into the enterprise level decision making of the organization. I mean, the title of this seminar essentially is, mergers and acquisitions and adaptive risk. These things are happening at the corporate level, and they're starting more and more to ask questions about what does this mean? What does this mean from a technology risk perspective to our organizations? And CISOs more often now have to be able to answer those questions, and you can't answer those questions unless you have a really deep understanding of how the interplay of technology and risk within the overall ecosystem of the organization. So I wholeheartedly believe that, what he just said. Absolutely.
Well, Ron, what does it take to have that understanding? I mean, you probably need to have time with the organizations to understand everything that's going on. Maybe more difficult for a new CISO coming into an organization to have that grasp of where hidden risk lies. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, the first thing is most of the identification of risk in the enterprise is probably not even done by the CISO, although they have a view on risk. The risk is, it really has to do about building relationships and understanding that you have to build a diverse stakeholder audience within your organization and bringing them in to get their views on what actually is risk and is not risk, and to help pull on those threads within each area of discovery that kind of leans itself toward this is a problem of some type of exposure, is having those other stakeholders come in and say, hey, yeah, you're right, that is a problem. And not only is it a problem here, that problem extends into those other areas because of the way we operate. So building relationships is really, really a big part of this.
So Drex, that's all very interesting. The idea that as a CISO, you're relying somewhat on the individuals in the organization. You have to build trust with them because you need them to tell you about certain areas of risk. I remember we had Aaron Mehring on recently, and he said he had this stop the line mentality he wanted his people to have. If you see something wrong, stop,
say something, yeah,
shut it down, stop. And he said, if ever I do anything to diminish that level of engagement or to make them reluctant to come to me and tell me something's wrong, I'm in a very dangerous place. But when we have that communication, I feel okay. It was one of those what'll help you sleep at night questions. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Toyota production systems guy, have been for years, and I've actually been lucky enough to spend time in Japan. I lived for 3.5 years in Tokyo, and so the whole idea of stopping the line when there's a malfunction in the process is very important to me too. And I think, when you hear folks like Aaron Mehring talk about it, you see how these techniques have been integrated into major health systems, into the way that we think about these processes, into the ways that we think about risk. And a lot of that ability to create the culture that will allow people in the organization to raise their hand and not think they're going to get slapped because they're pointing something out, but actually that situation where they're asking for help is actually a strength and not a weakness. That asking for help, that identifying a risk is a strength. That's an important part of their job. It's not something they should be punched in the throat for. It's a hard thing, I think, for a lot of organizations to create. People want to keep their head down and just do their job and, keep going. As you make that change in culture, It can be very difficult, but I think it's incredibly important, especially in this environment. You talked about the chief risk officer yesterday. Everyone kind of has to be in that mode of being a risk officer and finding risk and pointing it out, not necessarily harping on it, but being comfortable enough to say, this is a thing I think that could be a problem for us, and my boss needs to know about it. The chief risk officer needs to know about it. The CISO needs to know about it. So creating that environment, incredibly important to doing the stuff we're talking about here today, which is, identifying risk and then figuring out how do you continue to sort of mold and modify your programs to be able to account for a very dynamic, changing risk world that we live in today.
So, Drex, as I hear your thoughts and comments and Ron's, what came to mind is that, in the role that we play as CISOs, the risk perspective, there's an audience for that at the enterprise level, right? And these are typically your risk committees, executives, operational leaders, and in the manner that we represent cyber risk in the construct of overall enterprise risk, and then have perspectives from our stakeholders on, what would it take to really manage that risk. That has to be an organized process by which these risks are highlighted, the way you have mitigation plans around that, and the way you report that progress with committees and the board of trustees. And to Ron's point, a lot of that also depends on the relationship aspects. Have we been able to become a trusted advisor, someone that organization then relies on for representing cyber risk in a way that considers a wider perspective than just cyber. The second point I wanted to make, at the end of the day, we can manage risk at the risk register level, but our people and the safeguards and controls remain the strongest aspect of how we would address those risks. And to your points, we want to create a culture, we want to have an environment where no one is afraid or shy of reporting risk or an opportunity when they see it. And that's the culture that we're working to not just employ and build, but really promoting as risk officers, as security officer on a day-to-day basis.
So,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
If you don't mind, Sanjeev, I'll just add one more thing to that. And because when you get into risk registers, and especially in these complex environments that we live in within healthcare, one of the most important things when you get into prioritization and what work needs to be done today, tomorrow, next year, or never done, by the way, you need a way to negotiate and to build up transparency in that risk environment. The thing that you're saying, here are all these risks. You only can get so much done at one time. And there are risks that frankly, you're just going to carry or transfer. You can't do that without actually having a risk mindset. And it is becoming more and more difficult to prioritize resources and labor and all the financial components toward resolving the more, I would say, more aggressive kind of targeted attack vectors we see today. So it's really important going forward that CISOs really try and build a robust risk management architecture that really kind of fleshes out those details for really good decision making. It'll become more and more important, especially in healthcare delivery systems, as the pressures of costs and everything that's going on in that space as we move forward in that area. Thanks.
Ron, any thoughts on what that takes to build that robust risk management architecture?
Time and patience. That's the first thing. I think the first thing is you start from all the blocking and tackling all need to exist if you want a really good risk universe and a risk registry process. So the foundational, how you define needs and controls and whether or not those controls are effective and the analysis processes around those things all fold into developing a really robust risk universe and risk registry process that you can articulate outward to other stakeholders in the organization. But it really has to do with the underpinning. It's hard to start from the top and say, I'm going to build a risk universe and then build it down. All those things underneath the hood that provide depth and understanding and reduce uncertainty, and at least understand what is uncertain, what is not, is what helped really define risk in these complex areas.
But what you know and what you don't know. Ron is being very modest here. He has a really pretty incredible strategy around building risk at Texas Health Resources. And we talked about it, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, and he went through it with me. And I mean, I think there's a couple of different ways to sort of think about risk and talk about risk when you're talking to peers, and transparency is a huge part of this. But one of them is emotion, right? And in the world of cybersecurity, we often talk about that as fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And that's been done a lot, and it's still being done a lot, and it's pretty used up. And I think scaring people has only moved cybersecurity as a needle, and as an evaluation of risk, it's only moved it so far. And so most of the people in our business are really kind of tired of hearing that approach. But the other one is to educate, right? And this is a lot of what I think Ron and Sanjeev have done at their organizations, educating the organization about the risk that is there. There's so many great tools to be able to do things like drive business value analysis. We have some great tools at CrowdStrike that help you kind of understand what your spend is against a particular risk and the value that's realized after the fact. And then there's so many organizations that have been breached and associated costs that are available now for us to be able to draw on, that we can actually create some pretty legitimate numbers about what a particular risk might cost if we don't deal with it, or if we only partially deal with it. But back to Ron's point, being transparent and putting it all out there and letting everyone see it, very, very important, so kind of less FUD, less emotion, more facts about the risks that are there and the business value that comes from the investments in cybersecurity.
Drex, so we think that traditional IT security departments in hospitals, obviously we'll stick talking about hospitals, may have been in a bad place in the past, and it was more about slapping hands when somebody clicked on a bad link, little discipline type thing, and then slowing things down. So when security came in the room, it was like, oh my God, forget it. The project's dead. They're going to slow everything down. We want to transform, and I don't know what percentage of departments are still in that sort of adversarial role, but we're saying we need to transform from being hand slapping and slowing things down to being a true partner, getting that transparency and trust, because that's the only way we're going to know about the risk, creating a security culture where people embrace security and understand the point and why it's going to help us get to the mission and get the mission done. Do you see that as a transformation that is still ongoing and many are not there?
I mean, I think, I am lucky enough in my job today to be able to work with a lot of CIOs and CISOs and chief operating officers and others at health systems across the country. And I can tell you that when you've seen one, you've seen one. There's a huge amount of variation in what's in the CISO's domain. There's a huge amount of variation in what's in the CIO's domain, right on down the line. And so I think, yes, we're in a transition. We've not made it across the gap. Some are further along. I think that in Ron and Sanjeev's, particular cases, they're much further along than many other organizations in the country. And that really does, kind of going back to, I feel like we're kind of harping on it now, but it really does go back to building those relationships and having transparency and helping everyone understand their role in this. There's people, process, technology, and all of these things. And the technology, from a technology company, the technology turns out maybe to be the easiest part of this. The people and the process parts are the parts that keep us up at night and keep us in trouble, because we can't get those parts aligned. And so every organization's in a slightly different place, but I think aspirationally, you should be moving toward that more, better relationships, more transparency. That's what's going to ultimately win the game here.
All right, very good. Let's move on to the next question. Ron, let's start with you. When presented with a technology situation or scenario, how do you ascribe a particular level of risk to it so that the business owners can decide if they wish to accept that risk? What is your preferred way of describing risk to those business leaders? And do you employ storytelling, or do you need to be more concrete? I think Drex was saying that you have a pretty good system you've got going over there. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Well, sure. Well, first thing is we have all the standard things that most organizations probably have at this point or are building, which is kind of some canned checklists and some general orientation to understand what exactly the new technology is, how is it interacting with the system. A lot of this comes down to making sure you've placed the right people in front of that new technology, new initiative to say, hey, what is this and how is it interacting with the environment? Now, when we get into actually really analyzing the risk component, in an integrated healthcare delivery system, we end up taking two views on this. And the first thing is the safety view, and then the kind of the privacy and confidentiality view. And then that's all surrounded by reliability and continuity objectives, because all those things come around and have to flow into what is the actual true risk of that new technology or that thing interacting with our environment. And I think what's key on that is understanding what the technology will be in your environment and how it will interact. Remember, we're talking about very complex, these worlds that we live in are very nonlinear. They're nonlinear systems. I mean, there's a lot of change that just kind of goes on in these environments that are very unpredictable at times. We think everything's predictable because we manage it, but we know from history, things can be fairly random at times. So what we want is to build a front-end survey, if you will, of the system that helps us understand how it's going to interact. And then next, yes, storytelling is a bit a part of that. We use kind of scenarios that are more worded that somebody who is not a security professional will understand kind of what we're looking for. So we build it more into kind of a scenario, a bit of a story, kind of, but more of a scenario saying, hey, under this particular circumstance, does it handle these problems? So it could be as simple as password complexity rules, very simple, but we write that more as a story. We don't say, hey, do you use a particular technology or encryption or things like that, that they wouldn't understand. What we do is we build a scenario to say, would you prevent this from happening? And in many technology scenarios, what is key in this is that when you are interacting with the stakeholders of that technology, that the right people are being brought in. And this is a little bit of the plumbing, but just because somebody in the organization brings the technology in doesn't mean they know how it works. You have to partner with vendors and other folks that can help more clearly understand the overall use of that system. By the way, not only the use for the intended use, but the uses that might fall around that system. Not all, there's an intended use, and then there are uses that fall outside of that that will either grow over time or become unintended uses in the way it interacts with the environment. So that we usually pull on these threads on the front end through survey questions and making sure we have the right people in the room. So that's kind of the way we do it at a very, well, I didn't say it in a very technical way, but that's kind of the way we handle that.
Ron, quick point for clarification. The discussions you're describing, are they being had between your department and the internal stakeholders that want the technology, or between your department and the vendor?
Both, actually. And I would just say is a security program has to latch on to other processes. They latch on to IT governance processes, IT architectural processes. They latch on to, let's say, business architects that are working, or those business analysts that are working into the different services of the organization to understand what's going on. We bring them in and we analyze it as a collective to figure out what's going on. We document that, and then we, if necessary, we start bringing in the vendors of that platform to help articulate even more where the internal stakeholder could not answer those questions. And it happens actually quite often where sometimes the vendors only are the only folks that understand how something might work.
Right, absolutely. Sanjeev, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, Ron did a masterful job of describing how this process should work in an organization. We leverage a very similar construct in that we have a minimum security standards that we communicate, explain, educate our audience with. And the audience can be a technical member, a business owner, a risk executive, or a vendor partner. In most scenarios, what we attempt to do is provide a information security evaluation and a risk perspective for a given solution or a given topic. So for example, let's say a new software is to be acquired by a business owner for HR purposes. We would evaluate that in its full construct. We provide a feedback that's twofold. One, the full depth of technical evaluation, and second, a narrative that is much more business friendly or a audience friendly in terms of how we communicate that risk position to our stakeholder community. So it's a combination of approach. Really, at the end of the day, it's fact-based, so that people have an opportunity to look at how risk is evaluated and be able to, over time, if not day one, be able to improve their own understanding of how information security looks at risk, what are the controls that we're evaluating a particular proposal for, and how do we really come up with a disposition in terms of what risk it poses. And then conversation on that with the business stakeholder in the manner that we're able to then tell that story is extremely important. Because what I have found is that stakeholders want us to involve in them in a conversation where they have the ability to ask questions of us and be able to explain our rationale and then come to a consensus on a path forward. So maybe addressing issues that we've identified, or saying, the vendor will need to comply with A, B, and C, and that will give us ability to be ready for acquiring that software example that I leverage. And in all of it, really, we develop a trust equation with our stakeholder, where we're able to give a formalized feedback. We're able to entertain and be in a dialogue where we can provide a meaningful conversation with meaningful feedback, where partners feel like they can approach security and be able to get a transparent response. And if new information should change our position on a given topic, we go ahead and do it. We don't hold on to the old position just because that was arrived with a limited set of information. So I'll pause there, and I'm sure Drex would have some additional perspective on that.
I was just going to say, I'm glad we're recording this, because I feel like, this has kind of turned into a master's class, right? Of kind of listening to these stories. You can tell how much experience everybody has, talking about the unintended use of systems, and the reality that we've all been through we're buying it for this, but then it turns out 6 months later, they're doing something completely different with that system. And it's driving everybody crazy, because we never planned for that. Just those kinds of experiences you can't get unless you've been in the trenches, you've taken those beatings, and you just know to look for them now and to ask those kinds of questions. And then, Sanjeev's point about just, you have to talk to your partners on their own channel. My brain works in analogies, but like, if you like to communicate on channel 2 all the time, and the person that you're talking to is on channel 7, you're going to miss each other. It's part of our job as executives to figure out what channel our partners are on and change to that channel, so that we can talk to them in a way that lets them understand why we have the requirements that we have, and why we're asking them for the things that we're asking for, and allows them to communicate in their own way of communicating what their requirements are and why they're challenged with the things we're asking them about. And if you can't figure that out, you're going to miss each other. And as a result, you're going to introduce risk into the organization that you did not anticipate. that you probably could have if you would have just, taken the additional steps. So it's great fun to hear Ron and Sanjeev talk about this, because, clearly there's years and years of experience here.
I have a couple of follow-ups. Ron, let me start with you. One is, you talked about a process for reviewing software, different tools that stakeholders may want. I would imagine a big part of the regard with which an organization holds your department is how quickly these things get processed. If a review of a desired piece of software takes 6 months or a year, you're not going to be very popular, right? So speed, my point is, speed enters into this in terms of user satisfaction with you. You want to protect the organization from a risk point of view, but you also have to do this quickly. So your thoughts around that. And then one other question, when I asked you about, are you dealing as a department with the internal stakeholders or the vendor, I was thinking that you would never want to be in a situation where the stakeholders make the request and it goes over to security. And then, like we talk about transparency, then they're not involved until an answer gets spit out of security, which could be no. That's what you don't want, right? Because then it's all on you. They don't understand anything about what happened. They just know it was rejected. So your thoughts there around the speed with which you want to process these requests and reviews, and then keeping the stakeholders in the loop when you're doing the review of the new toy they want.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And by the way, sometimes speed or velocity, depending on the way you want to look at it, does not really work out that well. And like I said, in many cases, it depends on the initiative. So when the first thing is, throughout this process, the security staff, and we do, should have some type of service level target. I mean, if it's 15 days, if it's 30 days, if it's 1 day for emergencies, there should be some idea what the target is. I mean, there are only so many people and so many things that you can do around these things. In addition to that, of having a service level target, you need to have an exception process. In other words, when can the organization bypass it? And it sounds terrible in a way, and at what level, who can approve that type of bypass? In other words, we're just going to go ahead and accept what we have out of this based on any initial diligence we receive from the vendor and go with it. And emergencies arise. And by the way, so the program itself needs to have that level of adaptation. So it should have just a general level of tiers of service, and then an exception process for emergencies when something absolutely has to be done, who's authorized to approve that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, sure, lead times are really hard to do when you're dependent on other parts of the organization maybe to do something. Maybe you're at the contract level and you're relying on a contract owner to get a series of questions, initial questions, profiling questions answered. Their delays can run there. Delays can run in just a general technology review within the technology teams who are not really understanding what the internal owner of the new thing is trying to do. And so the security team is heavily dependent on other parts of the IT organization and the extended organization to kind of understand what's going on. And that should be accounted for at some level in the process. And this kind of leads into how we communicate. And what I tell the risk staff, and my risk team handles the bulk of this, is that continuous communication is important. Even if there is no updated status, a status goes out to the owners to say exactly where we're at in the process, where the constraints and points of friction are, what is required by them or who we're waiting on, full transparency to understand where they're at in the workflow in relation to the larger approval that's going on for the new technology or service that's being developed. And I think those are really important things. And we talked about communication earlier and how important that is. And this is one of those areas that can get a little sticky for many CISOs out there, is that kind of how things are getting through that queue effectively. And should be recalled, in many cases, security is the one area that would stop something. In many cases, sometimes the IT staff is pretty much just going to consume the problem and figure out how to deploy it with what they have. But security in many cases might be that one stopping point, other than some compliance issues or legal problems. So that's really important. That number one, I always tell the staff, know you got to understand, we never say just no. We rarely ever do that. And frankly, that would be to wait to the end of a large process and say, nope, we're not doing it, that would be very troubling for most in the organization. I think we're counting on a new capability to do their work and provide value in the organization. So for us, it's very much about communication and expressing those service targets.
Drex?
Yeah, again, great explanation, I think, of, looking at this process. The other thing I would say is that in my experience, having the teams really closely aligned, really well embedded with business, clinical, and research leaders so that they can anticipate these things coming. There's not sort of a documented and throw it over the wall process, but if you can tear the wall all the way down and you're kind of embedded in what they're doing, you can almost advise and guide them in the direction that they should go when it comes to technology solutions that help facilitate the business or clinical or research processes that they've built. And when you can do that, you can also guide them toward more secure solutions that offer less risk for the organization, but help still satisfy all the requirements that they have. It's just, again, this is kind of back to the make sure that you're on their channel and you're on their channel all the time. And if you are, you're way more likely to be able to sort of intercept these things really early on instead of being the office of no, which is nobody wants to be, those folks.
Drex, just to add on to that, I had my general counsel many years ago. I've been at Texas Health for 10 years, many years ago, I guess many would be about probably 5 to 7 years ago, said, hey, security needs to be part of the DNA of the organization. And it really about, and that's where CISOs really come into this. And it's about deputizing those internal stakeholders. And the closer we move the validation of security requirements into those areas of work and make it part of what they do, it's hard and it's not perfect. But the more you can deputize people, the more you can integrate and extend the program responsibilities outward, the more effective the program becomes as a whole. But when you get into these process level issues, you find that they just work a little bit better because there's a common understanding of what needs to be done.
They start to be your advocates, right?
That's right.
In many ways, right? You can invite them to your staff meetings and things. They start to understand why you have the position that you have. I have a really good friend who's a CIO, and I asked her, a year ago, how many security people did she have on her team? And she told me she had, 6,823. I mean, she was making the point that everybody in the organization had really sort of taken on the cybersecurity culture. And yeah, to your point, Ron, that's really important.
Yeah, listening to Drex and Ron, I feel like I need to go ahead and admit it on our behalf that we have overwhelming amount of requests compared to the capacity that we have. The couple of things that are embedded in that. One, we are trusted advisor to our stakeholders and our organization. And so the demand that we have on us to provide our perspective, either it's a response to say yes, or a modified architecture in one example to move forward with, or even having to say a hard no. All of those are part of our portfolio of work, and all of those examples are relevant in our organization. Now, I think what was really important message that I'm hearing from Drex and Ron is that we need to leverage internal processes from IT governance, from business engagement, to shortlist the amount of topic that we really need to provide perspective on, and what decisions can then be made based on standards for security that we have shared with our stakeholders. So for example, let's talk about employing a mobile technology for clinical communications. We've given standards and guidance to architecture review board, where a lot of experts and minds are coming together to solution for that, and they have all the guidance that they need to be able to design a secure solution. And then to the point that was made about exception, well, if the group has a deviation from what they would want us to provide perspective, it's a small subset then, right? It's not a full construct that we originally were moving forward with. So we try to give ourselves opportunity in the same way that my colleagues have described here, which is enable teams to leverage standards and guidelines from a security perspective as much as possible. And then we are people who can provide perspectives that requires further analysis or decision making. So that's one aspect. And second aspect of how we would engage and be within the so-called service level arrangements is really expanding beyond just the technical construct to even managing the portfolio of work that comes into IT and then comes into security. So having a IT governance for prioritization of portfolio gives us the best opportunity to then deploy our limited capacity to those very important projects, and where we must deal with a one-offs. It's then much easier to manage that versus unmanaged portfolio, and then it completely can overwhelm any organization, not just mine.
Yeah, in the spirit of everything's connected to everything else, IT governance is hugely important in this, because there are lots of requests at the open end of that funnel, but the things that may actually become operational are a much lower number. And you can't put, as a CISO, as a CTO, as a CIO, any part of the organization that's evaluating these things, you can't put your full effort into everything that is in that list at the open end of the funnel. You have to do an initial review and let it move to the next stage. And if it clears some hurdles with IT governance, with organizational governance, as it gets a little bit closer to really becoming an operational product, you can do a little closer review. As it gets closer to the end of the funnel, you can put your full shoulder against it. But you should catch all the important, like if you're really going to say a solid no on something, you should be able to catch that pretty early. At the end of the funnel, right before it's going through the final processes of this is going to probably in the next few months, this is a project we're going to do. That's the point at which you can really build in the full cost. You understand if there's responsibilities that you're going to need to add FTEs to the CISO's department or to the CTO team or something to be able to run that product more complete. You start to really define those numbers later on. But man, trying to throw your shoulder against everything at the front of that list is just, there's no way we ever have enough resources to do that. So the governance part of this is really, really critical. It just saves everybody's life.
Ron, anything else you want to add on that?
I don't think so. I would just, at the end of this, one of the keys is and we had talked about risk earlier, and I think one of the core duties of a CISO is that once it's all said and done, and whatever decisions were made along the way, that that risk, that latent kind of exposure, whatever is left over, the residual risk, all those things have to be inventoried and carried back in and repeated back into the program. Because at this point, as new technology comes in, new services come in, the CISO is inventorying this risk along the way and is building views so stakeholders can understand the kind of the risk that is growing over time, or maybe even shrinking. It all depends on how those populations are defined. But it's really important that this all feeds back into the larger program, can be articulated, and how well things are going at an aggregate level and within these kind of very distinct populations of work.
All right, well, time for my favorite segment, Ask a Co-Panelist. I'm going to put our friend Drex DeFord on the spot. Drex, a question for one or both of your co-panelists.
Yeah, I'm going to ask, I think, the same question for both. So it's really interesting to, have had some conversations with you prior to this, and then here, you're both involved in so many things. Ron, I think you just finished your law degree. Hope it's okay if I say that out loud.
Congratulations.
Yeah, almost done. I
almost done.
Last class, one more class to go. Very cool.
Okay, awesome. And Sanjeev has other responsibilities outside of security. And I mean, if I was a betting man kind of watching his progression, at some point he'll wind up as a chief operating officer somewhere down the road. But as you look out into the vastness of all of these young cybersecurity folks that are coming into the industry right now, what advice would you give them? The newest folks, the folks who are just coming onto the team, what organizations should they belong to? What kind of things should they be paying attention to? I mean, it's a great opportunity here, I think, to hear from both of you about what would you tell the newest of the cybersecurity pros coming on board. Sanjeev, we'll start with you. Yeah.
Yeah, Drex, thank you for your kind words, and what an important question. Anyone really watching the cybersecurity industry in any area of work, really, there couldn't be a better time and opportunity to serve in a mission of a given organization. For me, really that translates into how we make and reimagine patient experience. It translates into transforming patient care and clinician efficiency. It translates into mobility and operational efficiency. With cybersecurity, providing assurance for continuity of business operations. All of those and impacting lives in a positive manner with the talent that one can bring combined with passion is really what this world is looking for. So really, I can't find a better way to contribute to the society, to the world, to the organization, and I find it fascinating. Let me share an example with you. I have the fortunate opportunity of leading a new hospital build from a technology perspective, besides working on security matters. And I'm having an opportunity to partner with executive leaders, clinical leaders, operational leaders, IT leaders, contributors and staff and experts from all aspects of technology life. And just seeing that work combined with expertise brought to us from third parties translates into what I talked about at the beginning of my response, which is how it shows up for our patients and how it shows up for our clinicians. That's a fascinating opportunity. So I'm going to pause there because this question is going to give me an opportunity to keep going the entire hour and not have anyone else an opportunity. So I'm definitely going to pause there.
All right, Sanjeev, thank you. Ron?
Yeah, sure. So I would, by the way, a great question. The first, for somebody just coming into the profession, and the first thing I'm going to say is what will make people successful in this profession is really diversity of experiences. And that's Sanjeev was nailing it. It is even at our, once we're here, it's still about diversity experiences. And Drex had mentioned, yes, I'm doing a law program and I'll be done with that I'll be complete with that soon. But I would just say is I think I maybe have mentioned to Drex, if not, he'll learn it now, is I always tell people everything I learned about being successful in cybersecurity, to be very honest, I learned years earlier working in the military and serving as a maintainer for KC-130s and Harriers and working in quality assurance in that area, because you learn safety, you learned about the discipline of maintaining aircraft and lives are at stake. All those things came into play about how work is performed, quality management. So I would tell young people, it's about diversity of experiences. It's not just about security stuff, okay? Those are important, and nailing down skills and being an expert in the assigned discipline that you enter into within security is important, because everyone should be good at what they're doing or trying to be good. But also how growth happens is by diversifying those experiences improving mental models around the way you see things work in the world itself applies directly into like complex ecosystems like healthcare. It's very difficult to secure healthcare once you start really understanding what healthcare is because of its diversity in its own right within and complexity of the ecosystem. It is just so much stuff going on that it can be hard to wrap your head around. So as you grow, you want to improve your mental models, anything from, taking a class on, this might sound silly, but on quantum physics or thermodynamics or systems theory as you move along in the profession, probably much later on. But it is important to develop good mental models because of the sheer amount of complexity that's presented to a CISO. And the only way to negotiate and navigate that without getting buried so far in the details you become ineffective is being able to step back and relate it to something else a bit. And that comes from both experiences and knowledge gained. So that's what I would pass along to a young person coming into the profession.
So Ron, I got reminded of one more thing that I wanted to add then, because you articulated it so well. I think it's important that the passion component of then using your talent and skills to solve business problems is really how it comes together at the end of it. And you're right, the healthcare technology setting is extremely complex. And you can't have cookie cutter solutions for the challenges that we face as CISOs or practitioners. And so really kind of getting your root in learning how cyber hygiene works, how you could get visibility into cyber threats and being able to take action in an orchestrated way, kind of gives you a deeper understanding of security matters to solve business problems. And combination of that too with your passion that you bring would take you very far in the cybersecurity world.
All right, we're getting close to the end here. I think we've got time for a lightning round of final thoughts, final pieces of advice. So Sanjeev, let's start with you. Your final parting thought for your fellow CIOs and CISOs.
Well, first of all, just an awesome opportunity to have been in a dialogue with Anthony, you, Drex, and Ron. I'll be quick. New CISOs, have to be seen as business problem solvers, risk managers, who then pay serious attention to cyber hygiene, how ensuring safeguards and controls are widely deployed. And to my comment earlier about visibility and action, we need to make sure that we actually have visibility into risks, threats, and exposures so we can take a good action. Then as CISO, employ courage. I believe that's an important aspect of the role in serving as a risk officer and then serving as a trusted advisor. Always to remain focused on why we are in the organization to begin with, which is to enable business and leverage technology to transform care for our patients and improve their outcomes.
Perfect, Ron.
Well, that was really good. And I actually wrote some of that down. Thank you, Sanjeev. That's really
I did too. I did too.
Masterclass. Masterclass.
I would just say is from a CISO practitioner perspective, it is really important that as you know, and I reflected on this a few years ago, is basically about 3 years ago, I did a lot of reflection and came to the realization that I felt this was really bypassing my knowledge base. And I really didn't understand the risk I was managing, the architecture I was managing, and was I doing the right things for the organization for the future? And I think being as a CISO, you have to step back and reflect, collaborate with peers, and really ask yourself, am I doing the right thing in the organization? And if you're not, don't be hesitant. The courage comes into play to say, you know what, I think we're on the wrong trajectory. It's it's okay to say, you know what, might need to subtly start changing directions, and here's why. And that's the courage part. It happens in complex organizations all the time. You just have to be brutally honest and clearly articulate the whys behind those things. So once again, it's about reflection for CISOs, make sure we're doing the right thing. Are we maintaining the right skills? Are we bringing in the right people who can help us? Remember, this is a multi-party problem. It's not just a CISO problem statement. And so building those relationships and once again, improving your own knowledge and skills for the future is really important. That's what I would pass along. Thanks.
Excellent. Drex, we'll give you the last word.
Yeah, man. I mean, this is all great. You know, we heard a lot of good stuff today, just in the last little segment, you know, about passion and, you know, diversity of the experiences that you figure out how to give yourself so that you can think in a different way because of the collection of experiences, as Ron talked about. But I would also say, you know, the diversity of your team, because if you have diverse people on your team who come from other backgrounds and experiences, you're way more likely to catch issues and problems because they think about the world in a different way from how you think about the world. And then, you know, these ideas of transparency and humbleness and courage, the courage, as Sanjeev talked about earlier, about you've made a decision about something, don't feel cemented to that decision. The world changes around you, the technology changes around you. And sometimes you have to go back and look at those decisions and say, that was a great decision for that time, but that's not something I'm going to stick with now. I'm going to think about, you know, a new way of doing something. That kind of courage actually is incredibly important too. And I think it's one of the things that you see as a core tenet for a lot of the most successful folks in our business. So thanks for having us. This has been great. I really enjoyed the conversation. And you know, like Sanjeev, I think I could probably go on with this for another hour. It's been great fun.
Well, my final takeaway is if you're going to interview with Ron, you better take some classes in quantum physics and be ready to demonstrate your knowledge. It won't be that deep. Okay, very good. All right, that's about all we had time for today regarding continuing education. You can use the final slide in this deck. You'll get an email when the on-demand recording is ready for viewing. If you want to sponsor an event with us, you can reach out to Nancy Wilcox from our team, and you can go to our website to register for upcoming webinars. With that, I want to thank our tremendous panel, Ron Mehring, Sanjeev Shah, and Drex DeFord. I want to thank CrowdStrike for making this event possible and our attendees for coming. And with that, everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.